an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Magician's Apprentice, chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. In these chapters, Tessia is on the road and visiting a bunch of different people, but because she's a woman and things are not as evolved as we see them to be later on, she's treated kind of shitty and kept separate and not really trusted, apparently, by Lord Dakin. I won't say that's because she's a woman, but I do feel for her. She's in a weird spot. Class-wise as well. There's a lot against her, is what I'm saying. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode and for her patience in me getting it wrong and showing up having read the wrong book and just basically messing it up. But I'm here now and I'm ready to go. So this begins part 2, and chapter 11 is the beginnings of their journey out. It's pretty miserable. I really want to know how many people out there have experienced riding on a cart over a rutted road. I have, a variety of different contexts. For example, riding on a cart for like something fun like a hay ride in the fall. But also less fun, like being pulled on a cart in Guatemala over like cobble streets, which, let me tell you, not awesome. Cobblestone's rough, guys. It's cobbled. And the descriptions here, I feel, do a lot more to get across just how miserable this is than the descriptions I've read in a lot of other things. There's always an understanding that riding in a carriage and doing it for long distances is really boring and tedious and uncomfortable, like, because you're sitting for such a long time. But all of that is the sort of thing that you can really understand just being a modern person taking a road trip with friends in a car. There is a very specific kind of tension that your body develops when it's being jolted around, and you don't even realize you're doing it. Have you all ever been so cold that you were shaking and you finally come in out of the cold and are able to like relax, and you realize that your body hurts because all of these muscles were contracted and shaking? It's like that, but like for hours. And once you finally like get out of the cart, it is shocking. It's like you had your jaw clenched the whole time, which is, I shouldn't even say it's like that, because sometimes that's what you're doing to get through it. And even the weather is not agreeing with them here. There's just pouring down rain. There's mud. They're getting stuck. The horses are having a hard time. Everything about this is just like really miserable. And I appreciate a lot that she wrote it like this so that we get to see just how, you know, it's not all fun and games. It's not all romantic. So Lord Dakin is reflecting on how they're playing a game to pass the time. And while the game is that there's like a metal disc and a knife, and it switches between Tessia and Giant with whether they can whether they can hit the disc with the knife tip. And each of them gets a chance to like direct the disc or direct the knife and try and evade the other. And while this is helpful and it's distracting and keeps them from being too bored, Dakin is a little bit bummed at the fact that normally these kinds of trips are full of very interesting conversation. And Jayan is the one that he tended to talk to, and Jayan isn't even willing to discuss things in front of Tessia the way that he was like when she wasn't around. And I think Dakin was sort of hoping, even if Jayan wasn't willing to talk freely in front of her, that maybe Tessia would begin to loosen up around Jayan, and that has not happened. Jayan is, we find out later, Jayan realizes that he misjudged Tessia and that he's been a bit of a brat, but he doesn't know how to apologize. So he's just sort of falling back and letting her continue to hate him because he is too ashamed to apologize in a real way. Like, he just feels like, if I apologize, that means I have to acknowledge how I was behaving and why I was behaving that way, which was really about like petty jealousies and classism. And I don't want to do that. So I'm just gonna privately think more highly of her than I have thus far and try and guard my own tongue a little bit more and not be such a dickhead. But I'm not going to like reassure her that I don't still see her the same way. So she will continue to treat me the way that she has been. And it's really, it's a terrible thing, because as much as I want to criticize him for handling it this way, I've been here where I've really misjudged a person out of the gate, and I don't really know how to take it back, because I feel the same way, where I'd have to be like, hey, I'm really sorry that I thought you were totally full of shit and actually like a toxic person when you seem to be pretty cool. I really thought you were a fuck. I was wrong. Like, it's just like, I know it doesn't have to be framed that way, but I can understand how he's worried because of the misstep he already made, that in apologizing, he might insult her again. And also there's just not, that's making it a little bit too charitable. There's also just the matter of pride. There's also just the matter of having to admit to somebody that you fucked up. And it's somebody that you're not really like close with, and you don't have any sort of guarantee that saying, hey, I fucked up, is going to be received well or treated with, you know, grace, you know? So yeah, I feel for him in a way, because I struggle with how to apologize as well. There are times where I am so eager to apologize because the damage I did was so specific and so unintentional, and I really am desperate to like, let me show you how sorry I am. But instances like this are a little bit more complicated, because it's just a sort of overall attitude. You know, there's not one instance of him being a dick that you can specifically point to. It's his whole vibe towards her since they met. And that's a lot more challenging to apologize for and change without feeling self-conscious about how you act around a person from then on, because you know they're going to be watching you and your behavior and your attitudes. So anyway, Dakin is struggling seeing the two of them not really getting along, but I love that he's struggling watching this, not because he's like, I really wish the two of them would grow more used to each other and expand their horizon. No, he's like, man, it's boring, the two of them hating each other. This sucks. I really just wanted some conversation, and these assholes just have to sit here and be like brats about it. Like, come on. And I find that to be very relatable. So eventually they get to a point where there is a bridge that came down. And this is an interesting thing. There's a kind of like, because Dakin is thinking to himself as he's looking at the two of them, that Malia, the servant woman who is pretty much assigned mostly to Tessia, that she has also become more withdrawn and like formal, And he thinks that it's because she's like watching this magic in front of her. And most of the lessons that they did with magic were not in front of servants. So he's sort of thinking maybe the servants just didn't realize the extent of the abilities they had. And now that she's seeing it, she's sort of reevaluating what she thinks of them all. But Malia also winds up being kind of like assigned to Tessia, I think, because she's the only other woman. And there are instances in which Tessia needs to like have the care of a woman because it would be inappropriate for the men to take care of things or be around her at certain points. But then later, when they finally arrive at a household and they're going to be spending the night there as guests, Malia winds up like vanishing with the servants. And it's a really interesting moment that I like a lot because the whole issue with class has been there, you know, like Tessia is educated and she speaks well, but she's still not really upper class. And obviously, Giant is super aware of that, and that's part of the problem that he had with her. But then when she arrives here and she's like befriended Malia because she feels a bit more kinship with Malia than anybody else, then Malia goes off with her people, in quotes, the servants, and Tessia is left sitting there realizing that as much as she sees herself as part of that crew, she's not part of that either. She's not upper class, but she's not a servant. And then she thinks about the fact that as a healer, she serves servants. So really, technically, healers would be at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of social status. But it's the education, I think, the knowledge that sets them to be seen as higher, and because of their value in, you know, their practical value, that earns them some more respect. But it's a really interesting sort of introspection that Tessia has that I feel like, you know, it's something worth looking at today as well, taking stock of where you fit in social hierarchies. And we can pretend those hierarchies don't exist, but we know they do. And really asking yourself why you are considered where you are. Because it's something that I have only just started to really examine in the past 5 years and come to realize that, like, even having a white mother, I look Hispanic enough that I could have been thrown into a certain, like, class of people simply based on being Hispanic. But my mother is educated enough that she taught me to speak a certain way and read and, you know, have a certain sort of carriage to myself that made white people a lot more comfortable. And I don't have an accent either because Spanish wasn't spoken as the first language in my home. So that also changes things. And, you know, that's not something that's really looked at too much until she gets into the city and she starts to run across people who have married Sechakans or people who have married someone who has Sechakan blood that's very apparent in their skin tone. And it appears at this juncture that it doesn't really matter, that Sechakan blood isn't discounting people immediately. Like, they still trust. There's this one magician who has married a full-blooded Sechakan woman, and nobody seems concerned that she's going to be a liability. It's asked, like, do you think that she has some? But it's not, like, they take his word for it, and there's not a lingering suspicion, but I can't help but wonder if that's going to be the case. You know? I mean, it's certainly something on my mind in our current climate that if I did have any sort of accent, with the way things are going right now for people who are Hispanic and Latinx, like, I could be in some fucking trouble. I live in Texas. This is a bad place for me. You know, if I was to have any sort of, like, this, any one of the dog whistles for maybe she's not here legally. And I wonder if that's going to be coming up because they have a Sechakan servant, you know, who got left here by his master, and he's being fucking harassed by townspeople. So I can't help but think that this might be a theme that's coming up. And it's an interesting question because I don't know that this author is in a position to do this very well. We'll see if she can handle it. But the way that she has portrayed the Sachakan people as being uniformly brutal unless they are living in Kilaria. And the way that we have, like, the Sachakan servant thinking about how this beautiful, wonderful woman is nothing like the people where he comes from, it feels very problematic and white gazy. So I got my eye on it, and I'm hoping that she'll, like, be able to address it competently, but I'm also kind of nervous about it. So I just wanted to talk about that because the intersection of race and class is obviously incredibly important in our society. And I respect that it feels she's trying to address that in this society as well. And we'll just have to see how it goes. So this bridge is something that apparently the lord of this area is had been aware probably needed to be replaced, but he kind of like put out a rule that there should just be one person, one cart crossing it at a time, and trusted that everybody would follow that rule. And if that was followed, at least the bridge was going to be safe. And he was low-key saying that he was worried about a Sachakan attack and kind of thought if the bridge was weak, it might serve as a benefit, because if a bunch of Sachakans try and cross at once and it just goes out under them, so much the better. But it turns out that maybe he's just kind of a disaster, honestly. And I'm trying to find the name of this lord. Because they are talking about him, these village people, these villagers, Lord Gilar, that's it. And one of them calls him like, kind of a skinflint. Like they suggest that maybe he didn't fix it because he's miserly. And when he talks to Lord Dakin, it feels like that's not the case, but he could also just be making excuses, and that's 100% what it was money. But I get the feeling Gilar is just so indecisive that he winds up being stymied and not doing anything. And Tessia is kind of disgusted at the fact that this guy didn't seem to be taking care of his people, and when they finally pull up to his house a little later, she's already sort of got like an idea in her head that she's not going to like this guy when she meets him, which I really enjoyed this, that it's not even that, because I kind of expected, since it specifically mentioned that she's thinking she won't like this guy, I expected them to find out that Lord Gilar was lovely, that it was just a misunderstanding, that he really did care, that the townspeople feel a way about him, but they're not right about him. And instead, it's an interesting, nuanced thing, where Lord Gilar isn't just a cheapskate who doesn't care about people, but neither is he blameless and this was all a misunderstanding. He is somebody who doesn't seem to handle responsibility very well. And I feel like that is an oft overlooked type of person, that we have a lot of stories about people who are power hungry but don't care about people, or we have stories about people who are so selfless and almost saint-like. But then there's people who like mostly mean well, and they're just not good at this. They just don't really think things through, and it's not malicious, and they're not stupid. It's just a kind of like, they just don't really choose a course of action and follow it through. Or they kind of like waffle about, well, I don't really know what the best course of action is. Let's sort of leave it and let it sort itself out, which was kind of his like methodology with this bridge. So I like the fact that we're coming across other people who are in the same position as Lord Dakin, and Tessie is starting to realize like, ooh, I'm kind of lucky. Like, I live in a decent area. Lord Dakin takes care of his people, and he's like a good teacher too, because she starts to think, and so does Jayan when they're like alone, that being taught by somebody who is this sort of unreliable would be a pretty tough way to learn magic. So anyway, she watches Lord Dakin and Jayan make a sort of temporary bridge it's really narrow, but it manages. And she's happy about this because earlier, Dakin and Giant were playing a game that amounts to basically like a wizard chess. It's a lot of strategy, and it's meant to mimic battle. And Tessia, as we know, is obsessed with being a healer, and she just doesn't really like these games that focus on battle magic or battle and harming people as like objectives. And she says something about it, and both Giant and Dakin try to like point out, first of all, this is just important strategy wise. You don't have to apply this to doing harm to people or preventing harm being done to you. You can apply thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead and anticipating somebody's move to a lot of different aspects of your life. But secondly, Dakin and Giant are both aware that there is the potential for T'Chaka to be about to like fucking attack. And she doesn't know that. So her being like reticent about defensive magic, as they call it, is kind of a problem that she's going to need to overcome and deal with. And she doesn't even know that yet. She doesn't understand the context that she's living in literally right now. So she is, there's a lot about the world that she's like seeing as they travel that I think is really interesting and points out the way the world works to us as readers in a useful way, because I keep forgetting how much earlier this is set compared to the Magician's Guild and those 3 books. So they come across Gilar's house, and it's a huge house, and there's a weird sentence from Dakin here. He says, this is Lord Gilar's residence, and it's got all of these like walls and, those high, narrow windows that are meant to be like defensive. And he says, it was built before the T'Chakans conquered Curalia, when there were few magicians and fortifications like this, which can only really repel non-magical attack and were worth the time and expense of construction. I can't help but think that's like really not using your noggin. There's a lot of ways that one could use actual physical fortifications to be repellent to also magical attacks. And it's weird to me that it's discounted as really not being necessary. Like, I don't know. It's just the idea that all of architecture took a total left turn because they realized, this won't really defend against magic. There's a whole lot of other shit to defend against besides magic, and magic could infuse objects, right? Like, so use wards on your walls, like there's just layers. You don't need to focus on just one thing. And I don't know if that is meant to betray a sort of single-mindedness of thought, or if that's really what the author feels, but I guess we'll see. So Tessia goes, she takes her bath, she gets brought down to dinner, and as it turns out, she is not dining with everybody. The Lord's wife and daughter are put in a separate room with Tessia, and at first she thinks this is due to a segregation of the sexes that is like a traditional thing with how they eat. But we find out later it's because she hasn't been let in on the secret about what's going on politically, and Dakin doesn't want to talk about it in front of her. Unfortunately, to Tessia, this winds up putting her with a couple of people who don't interest her very much. Now, I have to admit, I had an eyebrow raised during this section, because it's Lady Pimia and her daughter Fenara. And Fenara is she's portrayed as being rather flaky and sort of preoccupied with silly things like shopping and getting a husband. And this is one of those things that I find frustrating. I will come back around to my overall takeaway by the end of this section. But as of right now, when I'm reading this, I was a little bit irritated because there's underlying attitude that is kind of misogynistic, that women being obsessed with finding husbands in a certain era is a point to them being really foolish, right? Basically. But clearly, in this era, that's the only way you can access any sort of power as a woman, is by attaching yourself to a powerful man. And I find it so frustrating that women were given one avenue to exploit and then get criticized for exploiting it, because we're not meant to want anything. We're just meant to be there for men. And so this attitude that Tessia is sort of frustrated by is something that feels to me a bit like self-preservation. She sees it as this girl betraying that she's not very smart or dedicated to her magic, and so she would be better off not actually studying magic anyway because she's not well suited to it. Whereas what I see is a girl with very few options who has decided she's going to take the more practical route of just worrying about who she marries, because she knows that is going to be where she's steered by her family anyway. And we can say that Tessia's mother has the same attitude and Tessia is not doing that, but Tessia wound up with she wound up in that weird position. There's a sort of privilege that does come with not being in society or having money, where you can choose to do things off the beaten track without there being a huge scandal because your family isn't in some sort of social spotlight. And there is an advantage to being lower class because of that. You can break the mold and it doesn't feel quite so dangerous. Fenara doesn't actually have that sort of freedom. She is in a much more privileged position, and the expectations on her are going to be a lot more constrained, and what she chooses is going to be a lot more public and spoken about, and her life could be a lot more negatively affected socially, which is where her power comes from. So I understand not wanting that social power to be tainted by deciding to focus on her magic, which in her eyes turns out to be of no consequence later because she's going to get married in the end anyway. So I'm just going to read this because I think this is interesting. She says she wasn't interested in becoming a magician, but her ability should bring a fine choice of suitors. So does learning magic deter suitors? Tessia asked hesitantly. Perhaps, Pimia said. Mostly learning magic would take up too much of Fenara's time, and she would gain little benefit from it apart from a few useful tricks. She's better off learning the arts of running a home and being a good wife. You can't become a magician just for a few useful tricks, Fenara added, grimacing. You have to go all the way. That takes years. There's no point marrying and having children until you're finished, and you have to go wherever your master goes. So, I see her point. If you becoming adept at magic means that you just basically have to go to college for 6 years, and you feel I'm not that into it though. It's not so bad. I kind of get it, but I feel like Tessia is really judgy about it. Listening to the young women list the advantages of not learning magic, which included the ability to shop and visit friends whenever she wanted, Tessia found it hard to imagine Fenara being a dedicated student, which, sure, she just said she doesn't want to be a dedicated student. Then she remembered Lord Dakin's lesson about physical limitations restricting what a magician could do with his or her power. Perhaps there were mental limitations as well. While teaching someone who did not apply himself would be difficult, teaching someone who simply did not take her power seriously could be dangerous. So then they start talking about going out and shopping, and Tessia is thinking oh God, what did these women consider entertainment? Although she doubted Dakin's allowance would extend far enough for such luxuries as jewelers, shoemakers, and tailors, Tessia decided she might as well take the young woman's advice. Even if she did not need it herself, she might be socializing with women who felt such things were important. After all, if I'm not going to be included in important discussions, I might have to make unimportant ones with women like Pimia and Fenara. It will be useful to know what they consider good conversation and entertainment. So, like, you know, I felt just so weird about this. There's just this sort of thing, like, women who are doing what they can with what they're given in society, being treated as if doing their best with that is somehow, like, evidence of them being less interesting or dedicated or whatever. And I can't help but, like, understand where they're coming from on that. Ashleigh says, maybe it could be comparable to these days when women are looked down on for marrying into wealth, when for hundreds of years that was our only option. This is exactly what I'm talking about, too. Like, so many men say that they want a traditional marriage, but then when their woman doesn't want to work, they're like, what? Guess what, guy? That's tradition. You make the money, she works at home. She doesn't go out and work. But guys suddenly have a problem with that part. Well, so you just want a woman who just is like doing everything plus 40 hours a week somewhere. Cool. No, that's not a thing. We're not doing that. And so women who, you know, get derided for being called gold diggers, girl, go make that money. People act like gold diggers are out here lying to the men they marry. Like the men they marry aren't aware they're getting a super hot woman because they're fucking rich. They know that. This is an agreement. We're making a deal. Woman gets money, guy gets a hot piece of ass. We all know what's happening here, but only the woman gets blamed for it while the guy gets admired for leveraging his money into having a hot wife. What the fuck? She should be admired for leveraging her hotness into getting security and stability in her life. Who cares? Let people do what they want. But anyway, yeah, so later on, I feel that this kind of winds up getting subverted a little bit, and I liked it. Because Tessia winds up meeting up with some other people and actually does go out shopping all day. And these are women, it turns out, of substance, who are noticing the world around them and talking about important things. And I like the fact that we get to see you can go out and shop and enjoy a lovely little brunch and have champagne and buy beautiful clothes. And that doesn't mean that you are a stupid person who doesn't care about anything. But it just took a little while to get there. And so for this part, I had a kind of a bad taste in my mouth. So anyway, we have the thing with Jayan where he and Dakin are talking to each other about what was going on with this lord Gilar, who is just sort of wishy-washy about everything. And then we get to this weirdness where Jayan says, surely it's in their interest to help us. There can't be much benefit to letting the enemy invade unless... Do you think there are some traitors? Most Kirelian families contain some Sachakan blood if you look back a few generations. Not yet, at least, and I doubt it would be for that reason. After 200 years, I don't think there are any who would not consider themselves Kirelian. They would rather think of themselves as descendants of the Kirelians who gained us independence than of the Sachakans who conquered and ruled the previous generations. I really like that line because that is just human nature, isn't it? We just conveniently forget about the people that we are descended from who were utter trash and terrible and pretend that we have to be descended from the do-gooders and the people who have like the most glorious history. It's kind of, you know, it's what leads to the defensiveness of white people who go and like tour plantations and stuff when they try and be like, well, you know, not everybody who owned slaves was racist. And they're feeling this way because they know their ancestors owned plantations and owned slaves. And they're trying to distance themselves from the fact that their ancestors were bloody, racist, brutal, inhuman people. Guess what? Just own it. That's in your blood. You can do better. You can improve on that blood. But fucking, you can't run. That's there. Whether you want to admit it's there or not. We all know it. You know it. And I like the fact that he's like talking about the way that people want to see themselves versus the way that it actually maybe went down. So what it comes down to is that they are going to be meeting up with as many other magicians as possible in an effort to decide what argument Dakin is going to take to the king, because he's going to go and speak to him about everybody's suspicions, and they're trying to gauge exactly how much to tell him and what kind of pressure to put on him to get him to agree to defend some of the outer lays. And they, it seems, feel that the king is not going to take the threat very seriously. I'm not totally sure why they don't think he's going to take it seriously, but they're approaching this like they're going to have to manipulate him into agreeing to protecting, because they all believe, when it comes down to it, you can't just leave the outer lays to take care of themselves and expect the Sechakans, if they do invade, to be satisfied with those outer provinces. They will be using the outer areas to test how weak the defenses are. And if they manage to get past the first few, they're going to push until they get all the way into the middle. It's not going to be like, oh, okay, well, we've pretty much got enough, so we're done. It's going to be cracking an eggshell, and the whole thing is going to go down. So we get this conversation between Dakin and Jayan, where Jayan is like confessing basically that he thinks differently of Tessia than he did before. And Dakin is like sort of watching him and not entirely sure how he, like, what has changed. Because Dakin is not really good at, Jayan can't express himself very well, and Dakin isn't really good at seeing what's going on between, like, he doesn't seem to keep an eye on Jayan and Tessia when they're not in a classroom in front of him. So I have a hard time telling exactly how insightful Dakin is to what his students are feeling and how they're dealing with one another. So yeah, he says, let's see, I'm trying to find the thing. Oh yeah, he says, something happened before he left. I was trying to be friendly, but instead sounded like an idiot. She got all defensive. I don't remember exactly it wasn't what she said, but the way she said it. And then it was as if I could see into the future. When she knows what she's talking about, she has such conviction. I imagined what that would be like when she was older and more confident, and it was almost scary. So I'm like, what the fuck does that mean, dude? And Dakin takes this as him being like, she obviously has a lot of power. And Dakin's like, I bet one day she'll surpass both of us. And Jayan's like, that's not really what I mean. And he says, I wish I was better at explaining things like this, but he wasn't sure how to. Once he'd found something to like in Tessia, her fixation on healing and demands on Dakin's time had suddenly become unimportant, and he began to find more things about her to like. Her practicality and lack of fussiness, how she was more inclined to hide discomfort to the point of her own detriment rather than complain. The hints he had caught of a great store of healing knowledge, which in itself was amazing in someone so young. But he had no idea how to communicate this or to apologize for his earlier behavior. So she continued to assume he hated her, and she hated him in return. So, yeah, I don't really know what he means about, like, it was almost scary. I feel like that isn't what I took from that, but we'll see if this turns out to be anything. Because it almost sounds to him like he's afraid that she's going to, like, I don't know what. It sounds like he's threatened. But then in, like, the next sentence, it seems like that's not the case. I'm not sure. But they wind up finally getting to Imardin. And as they go through the gates of the city, it is a bit of a shock. Tessia has never been to the city and has never seen real poverty before. There's a difference between the kind of concentrated city poverty that she sees here and the rural poverty that she lives around in Lord Dakin's lay. that is something where people can still sort of live off the land, and he supports the villagers because it's a much smaller group of people that he's in charge of. But this is a huge number of people. The concentration is really, there's so much more to provide for in such a small space. And because of their concentration, the filth that they live in and the disease becomes much more of a problem. These aren't people who are able to like spread out from each other in a camp. They're on top of one another. And if one of them gets sick, a lot of them get sick. And as she's passing through, she's noticing like how many people are covered in like sores or have growths that could really easily be taken care of. People who have signs of illnesses like scurvy and things that are just caused by not having enough nutrients in their diet of a certain kind. Just a lot of stuff that really like if you just look at that one problem, it's a very simple fix. And she is blown away that nothing seems to be being done about this, and feels like they need to have like an army of people out here as healers dealing with all of it. And there's not even enough healers to go around, even if they had them. And how would they get paid? And how would they get their supplies? It would all have to be completely like donated. And just the scale of the problem is really overwhelming to her. And I felt this. Like, guys, I mean, I think that it's an impossible feeling to avoid today, right? There, with social media throwing every problem in the world in our faces at all times, it's really hard to like feel like, okay, let me pick a thing and I'm going to make a difference on this one thing, because you have to prioritize one type of problem over others, which makes you feel guilty because you feel like you're saying, well, that's more important than this. Even if that's not what you're fucking saying, even if we all know that's not what you're saying, there is a sense of like, I want to do everything. I want to do a little of everything and help a little of everybody. We have people who are homeless. We have people who can't buy food for their kids. We have people who are, unable to pay for their medical bills, or people who are victims of racism, or, just like there's a million different types of problem out there. We have, our immigration crisis right now. And I just felt for her in this moment of closing her eyes and leaning back in her seat as this wave of depression overtakes her, and not wanting to look at Lord Dakin because she knows that he's just going to be giving her a kind of a sympathetic look, and she doesn't want it. She's kind of like, just thinking about the way he's probably looking at her irritates her. So, girl, I really feel that. So anyway, they wind up getting to, because like on the way, Dakin's pointing at the differences in architecture here, and there are some buildings that were built by Sechakins, which means they were built by slaves. And she's mystified that anybody would want to live there. And he's like, they're really well constructed and really well designed and have like hot and cold running water. Sechakins look down on us for the fact that we don't know how to do that shit, apparently, or that we just don't. We can look down on them for our reasons. And I'm like, well, human rights violations are a slightly different thing than having hot and cold running water, but whatever. So we get to this home on 3rd Street, I think it is. And, oh, no, they're on 4th Street. And she knows, because of the way the city's laid out, that this must mean that they probably have money, because that's close to the palace. And she meets Lord Laren and Lady Avaria. And Lady Avaria is the one that winds up taking her out shopping. And it winds up being like a lovely day. And she actually has a really good time. And Lord Laren is part Shechakin. And that's brought up later because she notices that his skin is like kind of tawny. And later on when they go shopping, Avaria mentions that she's buying this color to make a suit for him because she knows that his skin tone is going to look amazing with this suit. So they enter the house, and these women seem really approving. Avaria, at least specifically does, of the fact that Tessia is educated. And later on, when she meets another woman whose name I'm forgetting now, that woman is also a healer and offers to take Tessia to a dissection. And it's so funny to me because Tessia is like so excited. And, you know, if somebody offered to take me to a dissection, there's no way for me to not take that as some sort of like joke or threat. And for Tessia, she just reacts like somebody's offering her a treat. And I'm just like, we are very different people, girl. Like, good on you. We need people like you in the world. We do. I'm glad you're here. But Lord, do you have a whole other gut reaction to that kind of thing than me? It's just so funny. So it says both host and hostess had an alertness to their gaze, Tessia noted. As they turned to regard her, she had the distinct feeling she was being examined with astute care. A healer's assistant, Avaria said, I have a friend who's in training to become a healer. I should arrange a meeting over lunch or something. Tessia blinked in surprise. I was only an assistant. They may find me, rather wanting. Oh, I'm sure you're fascinating, Avaria assured her, and I've been looking forward to a new shopping companion. I like this a lot because Avaria doesn't use any pronouns to indicate gender in this sentence. So you can tell Tessia is assuming they're in training to be a healer, it must be a dude. And it turns out that while women are not allowed to be healers, supposedly, there's no rule against training. And so pretty much this woman is rich enough to get away with like bending the rules and is hoping to eventually be able to break them and be able to hide behind the fact that she has money in order to do that. And this is one of those things when people talk about leveraging your privilege and being a good ally. It kind of sucks in some ways that she is able to get away with doing this where other people might not simply because of her money. However, if you have the money and privilege to hide behind it, I do feel like you have a responsibility to push these kinds of envelopes on behalf of people coming after you so that eventually people who don't have this sort of privilege to fall back on will have the path smoothed for them a little bit. It's unfortunate a lot of times that, like in this case, this does not apply, but a lot of times there is a failure to acknowledge the privilege that allows them to do that in the first place. I appreciate that this woman just straight up is like, well, I got money, so they kind of can't say shit to me. A lot of times people will congratulate themselves on being a real mold breaker without fully appreciating what about their situation that's completely circumstantial and not actually due to any sort of like particular asset of their personality. They have not done anything to deserve it. They are just in a position by chance that allows them fewer negative consequences than other people might suffer if they did the same thing. And that irritates me when they try and take all the credit and act like, I don't know why nobody's done this before. When there's a very, very good fucking social reason why people haven't done it before. It's not that they haven't thought of it and you're so original. It's that they are in more danger than you. So I like the fact that the woman that she talks to later who is in training acknowledges completely that that is the advantage she has, and she's just trying to leverage it as much as she can. When you are at that sort of disadvantage because of your gender, you've got to do what you can, you know? The only time that I don't like that sort of thing is being at a disadvantage because of your gender, and so you decide to, like, leverage racism, which is kind of what, unfortunately, the suffragettes did in order to get the vote for women, was leaning a lot on, don't you want white women to be able to vote so that Negro men won't be able to overtake the vote instead? Very unfortunate and very real. It's in all of their literature. And it's a weird thing because it wound up being a good thing because once white women got the right to vote, it followed that women of color were also granted the right to vote. Black women last, as always, but that did begin to happen because the ball got rolling for white women. However, that methodology is not one that I can get behind, unfortunately. But yeah, there's just a lot of levels to this. And I really like Tessia learning about all of the ways in which you have to like navigate this social world. And Lee is saying, if you're wondering, I'm still looking out for any female characters whose names don't end in A, and I haven't noticed any more than the 2 in the main series. Yeah, okay, so that is actually specifically mentioned in a section later on. I'm trying to find the section where we're talking about the Sachakan slave. Here it is. Because we get a POV from Hanara a little bit later. And he's called Hanar. And suppressing a grimace, Hanara straightened and looked towards the voice. No self-respecting Kiralian man had a name ending in A, as their women did, or so the stable servants had told him. So they had shortened his. So I like the fact that that's specifically mentioned, because I think, Ashleigh, we talked about that in a couple books ago, that all the women's names end in like IA, almost all of them, and that is specifically a thing that the Sachakans do not do, and so they fuck with his name because they want it to fit what they find acceptable. Another like bit of racism, right? Where it's just this like, we don't like your name. That name that you've gone by your whole life, your name, we're going to change it because we don't like it, which is just such a microaggression. And it is a thing that a lot of people of color have experienced, that their name is like difficult to pronounce or just so unfamiliar to white people that they just decide, no, I'm going to call you this. And it's not even necessarily always a fucking like shortening of their name to the first few syllables. Sometimes like there's a girl named Latoya that got nicknamed Star in a friend of mine's class, which just like Star, and Latoya is not hard to say. It was obvious the teacher just didn't like the name Latoya and decided to call her Star because of whatever. And the little girl was not like in a position where she felt comfortable saying anything. So she just got called by something other than her name for the whole year in this class. So I just like that moment with Hanara. I was just like, oh man, that's rough. And we get this little scene where Hanara is being sort of tested. He thinks by being sent on some errands where he has to bring a wax tablet that has a message on it down to this other area, and it seems like they're sort of seeing whether or not he will actually like do the job that they're asking. I think I'm gonna read this. Hanara nodded his head at the other table servants, as the other stable servants did, to show respect to the man, and strode out into the late afternoon light. He tucked the tablet into his tunic, where it sat wax side outward against his belt. Hurrying down the cartway to the gate, he paused to quickly scan the village. The stable master had sent him out on errands like this a few times now. Hanara suspected his trustworthiness was being tested, and his usefulness. So he gets down to the store where he's meant to, like, it's basically he's got a shopping list. And this guy gives him a ton of stuff to carry. And it's the first time that the dude even, like, makes a noise at him. All he does is sort of grunt. And as he's leaving, Hanara's thinking about how that's, like, as close to a conversation as he's ever had with the guy. But he's not even mad about it because he was a slave before. And slaves are constantly in danger of, like, being accused of, you know, fomenting trouble. And so not talking is kind of smarter as a slave, to just keep your own counsel. So he isn't even, like, mad about it. And as he's walking, he feels something sting his arm, and he knows that there are these two young guys who come out here and just fuck with him all the time, and he figures that this is them again. But they decide to get a little bit more aggressive than they have in the past. And one of the things that, like, they get in his face asking about if he had a wife, if his master used to sleep with his wife, Or did his master sleep with him? And Hanara, it's weirdly like kind of rolling off him because he just is more preoccupied with how weird the wording is that they use to say things and how they don't know that he, as a slave, was never allowed to have a wife. So everything that they're trying to use to hurt him is utterly irrelevant. But then eventually one of them decides he's going to try and punch him. And it's because he accidentally stepped on that kid's foot because that kid was getting too close. And he tries to punch him in the stomach, not realizing that the tablet is in Hanara's tunic. And so his hand hits this fucking tablet, and the top, like, it's wax on one side, but it's also like slate. And the tablet does break, but probably so does that kid's hand. And Hanara walks away and is sort of smirking to himself because this kid hurt himself. But I can't help but think that's going to fucking come back to bite him in the ass because these kids could say Hanara did something to them. And then as he like turns around to look at the two kids, he sees a blue light blinking in and out on the hillside. And this was a weird moment that I didn't quite understand. Beyond the village, on the ridge above, a blue light was blinking slowly in and out of existence. His blood went cold. Turning, he fled down the cartway to the stables, his heart racing. He couldn't read the writing on the broken tablet down his shirt, but he was able to decode the pulsing light on the hill. The pattern represented one word, one order. Report. Takato had returned. So I am assuming Takato is signaling him to come and report. And that's what that is that he realizes that Takato is like utilizing him now. I am not entirely sure why Takato used this method of signaling, because it does seem really like, I just hope that you're going to be outside and looking in this direction at this particular moment, unless Takato was like getting his schedule, like was spying on him and seeing where he was at any given time of day. But it doesn't really matter. In the end, all it comes down to is that Hanara does not want anything to do with Takato anymore, but he's kind of in a spot where he's going to have to do what this guy wants. And I'm not excited to see that. I don't want to see it, but there it is. So I only have a little time left, and I haven't really talked about the meeting with all of the magicians, mostly because they don't really decide anything. Like, it's all of them gathered together, sort of talking in circles, as Dakin puts it. And he realizes that really, this isn't where shit gets decided. What happens here is that everybody airs their particular concerns or asks their questions, and he has to sit back and watch what it is that people bring up as concerns, and whether or not it seems like they have the knowledge to answer certain questions, and via that decide whom he can go to get the information that he needs on how to approach the king about certain things. So basically, it's almost more recon than it is an actual meeting. And they are just generally like blustering, and he examines the bluster for points of interest and finds out, okay, he said this, which means that he knows this person. He said that and asked this question, which I thought he'd, of all people, know the answer to. So clearly he doesn't have enough information for him to be worth talking to. So sort of what he's doing here is just paring down from the group of guests those who are worth having one-on-one conversations with. And it's an interesting thing, which feels very true to me, and I'm sure that's how networking actually works. I wouldn't know because I'm bad at that, and I also have never really been in a position where it's necessary, and I really never want to be, although I'm sure it's eventually going to happen. I just like networking. That is one of those words that puts me in a panic. Like, it's just because networking, really what it comes down to is putting yourself forward, pretending that you want to be friends when both of you know it's about like getting an advantage in a business situation. And there's something about it, this like, we both know what this is really about sort of thing, but having to also like be friendly is there's a mushiness to the like boundaries there that I don't like. So, yeah, you know, I feel like I would probably like if I put my mind to it, I could be pretty good at this because I'm good at reading people and managing people in a way, but I also feel like it would make me feel gross in my soul. And I don't like it. So, and what it comes down to in the end is just Dakin realizing who he needs to speak to about figuring out where the king stands on certain things, because they're all just trying to figure out how they can get those who are in outer lays to pull their weight in terms of defending against the Sechakans, because some people are sort of worried that they could get paid off. Like, there's been all this talk about, well, who has Sechakan blood? And somebody points out, they don't need Sechakan blood. They just might have debt. And the Sechakans have plenty of money, and they can be like, hey, just let us in through your patch of land, and we'll pay that off for you. No problem. So, you know, I'm glad that gets brought up, that that's just as much of a fucking, you know, danger as anything. Let's see. It's like in the UK, Chinese people will often give themselves English names. Right. And it's similar. I feel like when you give yourself a name because you're just making life easier on yourself, there's at least some agency there versus somebody just being like, oh, I'm just going to call you such and such. But it really does boil down to the same thing, which is realizing white people don't like to make an effort. So I'm just going to like beat them to the punch. But yeah, all right. So I feel like I've covered just about everything because nothing really gets decided there. Dakin is still like feeling his way through. And Tessia is hanging out with the ladies and gets invited to a dissection, which seems to be the peak of her visit. So I think that's everything. So thank you guys so much for hanging out and being in the chat. We had Martin and Ashleigh, and I think I read a comment from somebody else earlier. Did I? Maybe not, but I really appreciate y'all reminding me what people's names are and what's going on if I misunderstood a part of the story too. So it's helpful. 10 stars would do again. So hopefully I will be seeing you all soon with a new episode. And again, thank you, Ashleigh, for your understanding. And until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.